Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
Thanks. Yeah, it is really great to be diving into this one today.
So if you look at the trajectory of basically any major undertaking, right, whether we are talking about like building a massive multinational company from scratch or establishing a new social movement.
Oh, or even just attempting to fundamentally overhaul your own personal life.
Yeah, exactly. There is usually this deeply ingrained, culturally reinforced expectation of a clean finish line. We are raised on these narratives where the protagonist faces some escalating challenges, defeats the final boss, and then the credits roll.
Right. And we are left with the comforting assumption that the rest of their existence is just, smooth sailing from there on out.
Exactly. I mean, the human brain desperately craves that binary resolution.
Oh, absolutely. We want the world categorized neatly. Like, here is the struggle phase and here's the victory phase. We really want to believe that once the heavy lifting of the initial conquest is over, the new reality just sort of sustains itself on autopilot.
But then you step out of the realm of fiction and into the grinding reality of human history, into the actual mechanics of how societies and organizations function over decades.
And suddenly that neat little bow completely unties itself.
It really does. You realize that the initial victory wasn't the end of the story at all. It was merely the entry fee to a much more complex, much more insidious kind of struggle.
Yeah, the credits roll. Monday morning hits, and you are staring down the barrel of an entirely new landscape. The rules of engagement have completely shifted.
Right. It is the brutal reality of the messy aftermath. Because, winning the initial war is one distinct skill set.
Right, but winning the peace, maintaining the integrity of the culture you just fought so hard to establish.
Exactly. Resisting that slow, quiet creep of compromise is an entirely different and arguably much more difficult endeavor.
It absolutely is, and that is exactly what we are exploring today in this deep dive.
We are focusing our attention on a profoundly fascinating, incredibly raw, and honestly quite brutal section of ancient texts. We're looking at the Book of Judges, specifically chapters 1 and 2.
Yeah, and our mission here is not to just walk you through some dry academic timeline of ancient Near Eastern history.
No, definitely not. Our goal is to act as your guides to the underlying human mechanics at play here. We want to extract the practical wisdom, the structural insights, and the deep life applications buried within these records.
Right, and some of those applications are pretty uncomfortable, honestly.
They really are. And to do that effectively, and to ensure we aren't just projecting our modern biases backward, we are bringing in insights from a couple of foundational sources.
Yeah, we'll be leaning heavily on the analytical framework of Matthew Henry. He's a 17th century thinker who was just masterful at extracting behavioral realities from historical narratives.
Yeah, his insights are brilliant. And we'll also use Albert Barnes, a 19th century scholar, to provide that essential grounding context regarding the cultural realities of the time.
Perfect. So let's set the stage for you. The overarching context of this text is a massive, highly destabilizing leadership vacuum.
Right. The great leader Joshua has just died. And he was this towering, almost mythic figure who successfully brought the Israelites out of the wilderness and into Canaan.
He really was the ultimate centralized authority. For decades, this massive population relied on a single visionary commander. He dictated strategy, resolved disputes, kept their focus.
So his death represents a terrifying paradigm shift for them.
Huge shift. This nation is suddenly forced into a precarious transition. They're attempting to shift from being a unified military force led by one guy to functioning as a loose confederacy of individual tribes.
And now they have to figure out how to actually govern themselves. In an unfamiliar land, no less.
Right. They haven't even finished securing their territories. And they are surrounded by a deeply entrenched, highly developed Canaanite culture.
A culture that is, frankly, incredibly seductive, and they have to navigate all of this without their founding father.
Exactly. So what we are going to watch unfold, and this is really the absolute core of our exploration today, is a chillingly relevant psychological study.
Yeah, it's a study on the danger of the half-win. We're going to examine the exact anatomy of compromise.
Right, because it doesn't usually start with a massive, dramatic betrayal, does it?
No, never. It starts with a series of small, incredibly rational-sounding concessions. And those concessions eventually cause an entire society to completely forget its core values.
And this transition from total commitment to total collapse doesn't happen overnight. But historically speaking, it happens with terrifying speed.
It really does. It starts right at the top, immediately following Joshua's death. It's the very first decisions they have to make as an independent confederacy.
The people need to know what to do next. The land isn't fully cleared, the Canaanites are still a major threat, and there is no obvious successor.
Right, so the text tells us that the children of Israel, quote, inquired of the Lord. They asked a very practical, immediate question. Who shall go up for us first against the Canaanites?
Now, for a modern reader, the idea of inquiring of the Lord sounds a bit vague, right?
Yeah, it does. Like, how exactly were 1 million+ people supposed to get a strategic military answer out of the sky?
Right. Well, it wasn't a matter of someone just going into a tent, meditating, and coming out with a subjective feeling. Barnes provides some crucial historical commentary here.
Oh, right, about the formal process they used.
Exactly. In this specific ancient context, inquiring of the divine oracle was a highly structured process. It was likely done through the high priest, Eleazar, using something called Urim and Thummim.
Okay, let's define that, because Urim and Thummim is a piece of ancient terminology that gets thrown around a lot, but it rarely gets explained. What were they actually doing?
So the exact physical nature of the Urim and Thummim is, well, somewhat lost to history. But we know they were objects often thought to be specific stones or gems.
Right, kept within the breastplate of the high priest's garments, right?
Yeah, exactly. And they were used as a mechanism for casting sacred lots. So when the leadership faced a binary decision or needed to identify a specific tribe, the priest would essentially cast these objects.
Like rolling dice, almost.
Conceptually, yeah. It provided a definitive yes or no or specific selection answer. And the entire community believed this outcome was strictly guided by divine providence.
So it was a way to completely remove human politicking from the equation. Nobody could argue that one tribe campaigned better or manipulated the vote.
Exactly. The decision was handed over to this sacred randomized process, and the answer that comes back from this oracle is definitive. Judah is chosen to go first.
Judah. Okay, so Matthew Henry's analysis of this choice reveals some really fascinating structural logic here, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. God doesn't just pick a name out of a hat. Judah was historically the most numerous, the most populous, and therefore the most militarily powerful tribe.
So the underlying principle here is that service is appointed according to the strength given.
Right. The entity with the most resources, the most capability, and the highest standing is expected to shoulder the heaviest burden of duty.
Wow, that's powerful. Judah was first in dignity, and so they were required to be first in danger.
Precisely. And there is a deeper historical resonance to Judah being chosen too. Henry points out the longer-term symbolic layer.
Right, because Judah is the tribe from which the eventual monarchy would rise.
Exactly. The line of David, and ultimately in the broader biblical narrative, the tribe from which Christ, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, would spring.
So establishing Judah as the vanguard, the tip of the spear, it sets a precedent for leadership that echoes for centuries.
It really does. It's a huge moment.
But what really stands out to me isn't just that Judah gets chosen. It is how Judah immediately reacts to being chosen.
Yeah, their response is incredible.
Right. They receive this mandate. They have the ultimate validation. They are told they will be successful. As a leader today, if you get the massive promotion, what's your first instinct?
Oh, you want to prove you can do it on your own. You want all the glory. You centralize that power immediately.
Exactly. But what is the very first thing Judah does? They turn to another tribe, Simeon, and they extend an invitation.
Right. They say, come up with me into my lot, that we may fight against the Canaanites, and I likewise will go with you into your lot.
It is a stunning display of strategic humility. To understand why this is so brilliant, though, you have to look at the map of how the land was divided.
Yeah, Barnes notes this really interesting geographical detail. The territory allotted to Simeon was actually completely enclosed within the larger borders of Judah's territory.
Wow, so they were geographically embedded.
Exactly. An enemy threatening Simeon was inherently threatening Judah, and vice versa. Their security interests were inextricably linked.
They recognized that siloed thinking would be fatal here. Judah is the biggest, strongest tribe. They just got the nod to lead the charge.
They easily could have said, stand back, little brother, we've got this.
But instead, they actively seek a partnership because they understood a fundamental reality about large-scale endeavors. True strength does not isolate itself.
And Matthew Henry highlights this dynamic beautifully. He points out that the strongest should never despise, but rather actively desire and cultivate the assistance of those who might be nominally weaker.
Right. The head cannot say to the foot, I have no need of you. Even the most powerful entity in the room recognized the absolute necessity of strategic alliance.
This translates so perfectly to how we operate today. Think about your own life, your career, your community efforts.
Yeah, when you are facing a massive undertaking, maybe restructuring a department or navigating a complex legal issue, who is your Simeon?
Are you humble enough to look at the people whose interests align with yours, even if they have fewer resources, and ask them to partner with you?
Or does your ego demand that you maintain total control so you don't have to share the credit?
Exactly. And the reciprocity of Judah's offer is what makes it a true partnership, not just a delegation of labor. Judah says, I will then take my forces and help you clear yours.
It requires mutual vulnerability. If you want to find a Simeon to support your goals, you have to be fully prepared to act as a Simeon for them later.
Right. So this alliance is forged. Judah and Simeon combine forces, they march out, and initially they see massive success.
They do. They encounter an army at Bezek and completely rout them. But here is where we hit a section of the narrative that is incredibly jarring.
Oh yeah, it forces us to confront the brutal reality of the ancient world.
They capture the leader of this opposing force, a king named Adoni-Bezek, and the text describes how they deal with him. They cut off his thumbs and his big toes.
Yeah.
It's rough.
I mean, I have to be honest, reading that today, it feels barbaric. It reads like straight up torture. How do we extract any kind of enduring wisdom from an act of such explicit violence? It is a really difficult passage, and it absolutely should give a modern reader pause. If we just look at the physical act, it is horrifying.
Right.
But to understand the mechanism of what is happening, we have to look past the gore and examine Adoni-Bezek's own reaction to his mutilation. And we have to look at the historical context Matthew Henry provides.
Because Adoni-Bezek doesn't just scream in agony, right?
No, he doesn't just curse his captors. He actually makes this profound, almost philosophical confession of justice. He says, 70 kings, having their thumbs and their big toes cut off, gathered their food under my table. As I have done, so God has requited me.
Wait, 70 kings? He had done this exact same thing to 70 other leaders.
Yes. And that one detail changes the entire complexion of the event. This wasn't a random, spontaneous act of sadism invented by the Israelites.
Ah, so it was the precise application of the ancient law of retaliation, lex talionis.
Exactly. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and in this gruesome case, a thumb for a thumb. Henry points out that Adoni-Bezek was a historic tyrant.
He hadn't just defeated his rivals. He created a literal, physical underclass of mutilated monarchs.
Right. Kept them crawling under his table like dogs, scavenging for scraps, just for his own amusement, and to project absolute terror.
And if we think about the actual mechanics of ancient warfare, cutting off the thumbs and big toes isn't just about pain. It is highly calculated neutralization.
Precisely. Without thumbs, a man in the Bronze Age cannot draw a heavy bowstring. He can't hold a sword. He is permanently disarmed.
And without big toes, you lose your physical equilibrium. You can't sprint or plant your feet in combat.
Right. Adoni-Bezek was systematically ensuring his enemies could never rise against him again, while keeping them alive as grotesque trophies.
So when Judah captures him, they essentially hold up a mirror. They subject him to the exact nightmare he designed for others.
Yeah. Now, obviously, we need to exercise some serious discernment here.
Very much so. We are reading a historical account of ancient Near Eastern warfare. It is not prescribing this kind of cruelty for today.
Right. We aren't supposed to go around physically dismantling our corporate rivals.
Yeah, please do not sabotage the careers of people who wrong you. But the enduring wisdom, the truth that transcends the centuries, is the inescapable nature of consequence.
Exactly. What is fascinating is that Adoni-Bezek's own conscience is suddenly awakened by experiencing his own cruelty.
He acknowledges the terrifying symmetry of the justice he receives. The insight here is that arrogant, abusive leaders are remarkably often brought low by the exact methods they use to oppress others.
It is the architectural equivalent of building a trapdoor into a stage, forgetting where you put it, and then falling through it during your own performance.
That is a perfect analogy. If you build a team culture around backstabbing and paranoia, you shouldn't be shocked when your own career is eventually dismantled by a subordinate using those exact same tactics.
The world just has a remarkable, almost poetic way of reflecting our own character back to us through our circumstances. The environment you create for others is ultimately the environment you will have to live in.
So true. Now, from that intense, dark reality of battlefield justice, the text suddenly pivots to a completely different kind of story.
Yeah, it zooms way in on a family dynamic and a negotiation over real estate.
We were reintroduced to Caleb, who was one of the legendary original scouts from Joshua's generation. He's an old man now, but still fierce.
Very fierce. He offers his daughter, Achsah, in marriage to whoever can successfully conquer a specific fortified city called Kiriath-Sefer.
And a warrior named Othniel steps up, takes the city, and marries Achsah. The conquest part is standard ancient history, but what happens next is where the real practical insight lies.
Right, because Achsah is given to Othniel, and they're moving to their new land. But Achsah refuses to just passively accept her situation.
She evaluates the reality of what she has actually been given, and she realizes it is fundamentally flawed.
She does. The text says she urges her husband to ask her father for a field, but then she just takes matters into her own hands.
She physically gets off her donkey as she approaches Caleb, and Caleb asks her, "What do you wish?"
And she looks at him and says, "Give me a blessing. For you have set me in the land of the south. Give me also springs of water."
And Caleb responds by giving her the upper springs and the lower springs. So how do we translate this ancient agricultural exchange into a modern, actionable framework?
It is a phenomenal masterclass in the mechanics of self-advocacy and resource negotiation. We have to look at the geography first.
Okay, what does Barnes say about the geography there?
He notes that the Southland, the Negev, was notoriously arid. It was dry, extremely difficult terrain.
So Achsah recognized a critical structural problem. She had been given territory, which implies status, but not the resources required to make it productive.
She understood that owning dry dirt wasn't a blessing. It was a massive burden, unless she had the water to cultivate it.
Wow, she didn't let the prestige of the gift blind her to the practical reality of what it would take to succeed there.
Exactly. She identifies the exact missing component, the water, and goes directly to the person who holds the authority to distribute it.
And look at the specificity of her request. She doesn't just complain, "This land is too hard." She explicitly asks for springs of water.
And Caleb, importantly, is not offended by her boldness. He respects the clarity of the request.
He gives her both the upper and lower springs, ensuring comprehensive irrigation. This happens all the time in modern professional settings, doesn't it?
Oh, constantly. Imagine you get a massive promotion. You are given a new, prestigious title, a corner office.
You've been given the Southland, but if you just accept the title without evaluating the infrastructure, you might find yourself in deep trouble.
Right. If you don't explicitly sit down and negotiate for the operational budget, the headcount, the software tools you actually need, you are going to fail.
You will just be farming dry dirt. A lot of people suffer in silence in their roles because they assume leadership should just magically know what they need.
But often, leadership is just like Caleb. They are perfectly willing to allocate the resources, but they are waiting for the person on the ground to have the operational clarity to identify the need.
And the professional courage to articulate it directly. If you need springs of water to make your project thrive, you have to get off the donkey and ask for them.
Perfectly said.
So backing out to the wider lens, Judah has been incredibly successful. They've formed alliances, executed justice, negotiated for resources.
The text lists a string of major victories. They take Jerusalem, which Barnes notes was a massive strategic achievement.
They take Hebron, push into Philistine territory, taking Gaza, Ashkelon. To a casual observer, they are an unstoppable juggernaut.
Operating with absolute divine backing. But then we hit Judges chapter 1, verse 19.
And the entire trajectory of the book, and really the history of the nation, slams into a brick wall.
This single verse is the hinge upon which the entire tragic narrative of compromise turns.
Let me read it. The text says, "The Lord was with Judah, and he drove out the inhabitants of the hill country, for he could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley because they had chariots of iron."
Yeah.
I really want us to spend some serious time here because on a surface reading, this makes absolutely zero logical sense. I am genuinely baffled.
It is a massive contradiction on the surface.
They just defeated armies of thousands, breached fortified walls. The text explicitly states the creator of the universe is actively fighting with them. So why do carts with metal rims suddenly stop them cold?
Right. How does advanced metallurgy trump divine mandate? It is the most critical question of the chapter.
So what's the answer?
The answer lies entirely in human psychology, not military logistics. Matthew Henry provides a piercing analysis of this exact contradiction.
Okay.
He points out that this was not a sudden failure of divine power. It was a profound, catastrophic failure of human resolve.
Wow. So when the men of Judah looked down into the plains, their fear of the physical reality overrode their faith in the promise.
Exactly. Let's break down the physical reality. Why were iron chariots so terrifying to them?
Yeah, what was the actual tactical experience of facing them?
We have to put ourselves in the sandals of an ancient Israelite infantryman. These are foot soldiers. They're accustomed to fighting in the rugged terrain of the mountains.
Where agility and close quarters combat are advantageous and chariots are basically useless.
Right. But down in the flat, open valleys, the chariot was the undisputed superweapon of the Bronze Age. They were fast, heavily armored, and often had blades attached to the wheels.
So it's essentially an ancient tank.
Exactly. Imagine standing on a flat plain with a spear and a leather shield and watching a line of these heavy, iron-reinforced vehicles charging directly at you.
Kicking up a massive cloud of dust, the deafening sound of iron wheels grinding, the psychological terror would be immense.
It was. The Israelites looked at the cutting-edge military technology of the Canaanites, calculated the physical disadvantage of fighting on open ground, and did a very human risk assessment.
They decided that the cost of victory was simply too high.
They rationalized quitting. They probably told themselves, look, God helped us take the mountains. Maybe we are just mountain people.
Maybe we aren't meant to have the valleys. We've won enough. Let's not push our luck.
And Harry explicitly calls this out. He says they meanly withdrew their forces when, with one bold stroke, they might have completed their victories.
They allowed a highly localized, highly visible disadvantage, the iron chariots, to completely derail their overarching mission.
They couldn't trust the process when the variables changed and the environment no longer favored their traditional tactics.
And this specific kind of failure happens constantly in modern organizations.
All the time.
Say a company decides to completely modernize operations. They successfully restructure the hierarchy, that's taking the hill country. They rewrite HR policies, that's taking the fortified cities.
They're riding high on their success.
Right. But then they get to the final stage, migrating all legacy data to a highly complex new software system. The employees look at the new system, realize how steep the learning curve is, and they panic.
The new software is their iron chariot. It looks too formidable.
Exactly. So what do? They decide to just keep using the old broken system for the final step. It creates a massive bottleneck that ruins the efficiency of everything else they just built.
They settle for the half win. And the tragedy of the half win is that it never stays localized.
Right. The decision to stop short at the valley doesn't just affect Judah. The rest of chapter 1 proves that compromise is a highly virulent contagion.
Because Judah was the vanguard. They were the tribe chosen by the oracle to set the standard.
So the moment the bravest, strongest, most well-resourced tribe finds a plausible excuse to quit, it instantly provides psychological cover for every other tribe to do exactly the same thing.
And we see it cascade through the narrative in this depressing, repetitive litany of failure. The text shifts from a chronicle of victories to a ledger of abandoned responsibilities.
Benjamin fails to drive out the Jebusites from Jerusalem.
The house of Joseph captures Bethel. But during the siege, they capture a Canaanite informant. In exchange for him showing them the secret entrance, they let him and his family go free.
And what does that informant do? The text says he just goes into the land of the Hittites, builds a brand new city, and calls it Luz.
Right, he just relocates the Canaanite culture somewhere else. They didn't solve the problem, they just pushed it slightly down the road.
It's the illusion of resolution. And the list goes on. Manasseh fails to clear Beth-shean, Ephraim stops short in Gezer, Zebulun, Asher, Naphtali, every single one fails to complete their mandate.
They all hit their own version of the iron chariots, look at Judah's example, and decide to lay down their arms.
But as you read further into the chapter, the why behind their failure starts to shift, doesn't it?
It does. It wasn't always just raw, paralyzing fear of advanced weaponry. A much more insidious, calculated motivation begins to emerge.
Look at verse 28. It says, "When Israel had grown strong, they put the Canaanites to forced labor and didn't utterly drive them out." Let's pause and dissect this.
Yeah, this is key.
Because if they had grown strong enough to enslave the Canaanites, they were clearly strong enough to defeat them and drive them out like they were instructed. So why pivot to forced labor?
Because their initial cowardice evolved into economic covetousness. This is where the anatomy of compromise gets incredibly dark. Matthew Henry astutely observes that as the Israelites gained a foothold, they realized that the sheer physical labor and economic output of the Canaanites would do them more immediate, tangible good than fighting a difficult war to remove them.
They did a cost-benefit analysis on their core values, and their values lost.
Exactly. They thought, Why go through the pain and exhaustion of continued conflict when we can just tax these people? We can make them harvest our fields and pay us tribute.
They completely commodified their compromise. They prioritize economic convenience and cheap labor over their long-term cultural integrity.
It's terrifying, really.
It's such a devastating mirror for how we function today. The concept of putting the enemy to forced labor translates perfectly to how we rationalize the toxic elements in our own businesses.
Like tolerating a brilliant but incredibly abusive employee because they're the top salesperson.
Exactly. We tell ourselves, yes, they are destroying the morale of the team, but they bring in 30% of our revenue. I can manage them. I can put their toxicity to forced labor for the bottom line.
Or consider it on a personal level. Someone knows they have a deeply unhealthy coping mechanism, drinking too much, or maintaining a manipulative relationship.
But they rationalize it by saying, it helps me de-stress, or this person has great connections. We think we have the compromise contained.
We think we are taxing it for our benefit. But the terrifying structural truth of compromise is that it is never static. If you tolerate it, it will eventually turn the tables.
And the text proves this dramatically. Look what happens to the tribe of Dan at the end of the chapter. Dan doesn't just fail to drive out the Amorites. The dynamic completely flips.
The text says the Amorites actually forced the children of Dan into the mountains and would not allow them to come down to the valley.
Dan thought they could coexist with the compromise, and the compromise literally displaced them from their own inheritance.
They lost their territory to the very people they were supposed to be commanding. When you try to domesticate a deeply destructive force simply because it offers a temporary convenience, you are inviting your own displacement.
So if you are listening to this right now, this is the moment to do a brutally honest audit of your own landscape. What are the iron chariots in your life right now?
What is the deeply difficult conversation or the toxic relationship that you're actively avoiding because fighting it seems too hard?
Where are you choosing the comfort of the half-win? Because history and human psychology both scream the same warning. The half-win will eventually cost you the entire game.
Which brings us perfectly into the consequences detailed in Chapter 2. The era of physical conquest, flawed as it was, is over.
But the spiritual, cultural, and psychological fallout is just beginning to materialize, and it starts with a deeply intense divine confrontation.
The opening of Chapter 2 sets a very specific scene. It says that the angel of the Lord came up from Gilgal to a place called Bochim.
Now, whenever we encounter the phrase angel of the Lord in these ancient texts, we need to clarify what is actually happening. Is this just a messenger with wings?
Barnes's commentary provides essential theological framing here. In the Hebrew Bible, the specific phrase, the angel of the Lord, frequently designates a direct divine manifestation.
Often understood as the angel of the covenant, right? God himself taking a form to interact with humanity.
Yes, and we know this isn't just a subordinate messenger because of the pronouns used. The angel speaks entirely in the first person, assuming the voice and authority of the Creator.
He says, I brought you up out of Egypt. I said, I will never break my covenant with you.
And Barnes also points out the immense significance of the geography here. The text specifically notes that the angel comes from Gilgal.
Why mention Gilgal?
Because Gilgal wasn't just a spot on the map. When the Israelites first crossed the Jordan River into Canaan, Gilgal was their first base camp. It was where they set up memorial stones.
It was where they formally renewed their covenant and celebrated the Passover in the new land.
Right. Gilgal represented their first love, their initial purity of purpose, and their absolute dependence on God before they got distracted by the wealth of Canaan.
So, the angel traveling from Gilgal to confront them is a profound physical guilt trip. It is a visual reminder of the massive chasm between the promises they made at the beginning and the messy reality of where they are now.
And the angel arrives to deliver a blistering indictment. He doesn't sugarcoat it. He reminds them of the explicit instructions. You shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall break down their altars.
And then he points the glaring reality. But you have not listened to my voice. Why have you done this?
He asks the piercing question of motivation, but he doesn't even wait for an answer because the evidence is everywhere. He immediately lays out the long-term consequence of their economic pragmatism.
He says, I will not drive them out from before you, but they shall be in your sides, and their gods will be a snare to you.
Matthew Henry notes that a more visceral translation of that phrase is, they shall be thorns in your sides.
Oh, man, it is a brilliant, terrifying psychological diagnosis. Because they refused to deal with the root of the problem when they had the mandate, the problem isn't going to destroy them overnight.
Instead, it is going to become a chronic condition. a permanent source of irritation, pain, and subtle temptation.
And the metaphor of the snare is particularly apt. A snare isn't a wall that stops you in your tracks. It's a hidden trap that entangles you when you are just walking along completely unaware.
By leaving the Canaanite altar standing because it was inconvenient to tear them down, they left the traps set for their own feet and the feet of their children.
Now, here is where human psychology gets incredibly slippery. How do the Israelites react when they are confronted with this devastating truth by a divine messenger?
Verse 4 says, "When the angel of the Lord spoke these words, the people lifted up their voice and wept."
They cry so intensely with such profound collective grief that they actually rename the location Bokem, which literally translates to weepers, and they follow it up by offering sacrifices to the Lord right there on the spot.
If you are watching this unfold like a movie, it looks like the perfect climax of redemption. It looks like a massive moment of genuine repentance.
It sounds like they finally get it. But we have to ask the critical question. When the tears dried, did anything actually change?
This is where Matthew Henry's analysis cuts straight to the bone. He looks at the subsequent history and observes a tragic reality. They wept, yes. They experienced an overwhelming emotional catharsis.
But when the assembly dismissed, they didn't go home and take sledgehammers to the Canaanite altars in their neighborhoods, did they?
No, they didn't. They didn't dissolve the profitable trade leagues they had established. They experienced the pain of guilt, but they completely substituted emotional regret for actual behavioral change.
Wow, that is the illusion of sorrow. We are incredibly prone to confusing the act of feeling bad about a destructive behavior with the act of actually repenting of it.
Biologically, we know exactly why this happens. When we cry, when we have a massive emotional release, our brains release endorphins and oxytocin. It literally soothes us.
We feel a profound sense of relief. And because we feel relief, our brains trick us into believing we have actually accomplished something.
We think, I felt the pain of my mistake, therefore I have dealt with the mistake. But the structural reality, the altars, the bad habits, hasn't shifted 1 inch.
This maps perfectly onto modern apology culture. We see it constantly in the public sphere. A public figure is caught engaging in terrible behavior. They post a tear-stained apology video.
They talk about how broken they are, how much work they need to do.
The public watches the emotion, applauds the vulnerability, and moves on. But 6 months later, that person is caught doing the exact same thing again, because the tears were performative and no structural changes were made.
Or think about it in the context of therapy. A person can go to a therapist every Tuesday, sit on a couch, cry their eyes out about their toxic workplace, and experience a massive sense of emotional release.
But if they leave that office and refuse to establish the hard boundaries they discussed, they are just returning to Bokem every week to weep while leaving the altar standing in their living room.
It's a harsh reality to face.
So the deeply practical question you have to ask yourself is this. Are you substituting emotional regret for actual structural change?
When you realize you've compromised your values, do you just wallow in the guilt until the feeling passes, or do you grab a sledgehammer?
You have to dismantle the infrastructure that allowed the compromise to happen in the first place. But the Israelites chose the tears without the sledgehammer.
And the narrative immediately zooms out to show us the devastating long-term consequences of that choice. In verses 6 through 10, the text does this fascinating cinematic rewind.
It loops back in time, back to the death of Joshua, to explain the exact mechanics of how and why this culture collapsed so thoroughly and so quickly.
It sets up the baseline. It reminds us that the people actually did serve the Lord all the days of Joshua and critically all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua.
So as long as there was a living, breathing cohort of leaders who had personally witnessed the great works, the plagues in Egypt, the parting of the sea, the cultural center held,
the institutional memory was strong enough to keep the society aligned with its values. But then comes a verse that should send a shiver down the spine of any parent or CEO.
Verse 10, it reads, "After all that generation were gathered to their fathers, another generation arose after them who didn't know the Lord, nor the work which he had done for Israel."
It is staggering. How is it mechanically possible for a society to just forget its foundational identity in a single generation?
It is the ultimate testament to the terrifying fragility of corporate memory. We operate under this dangerous assumption that deep cultural values are just genetically inherited or absorbed by osmosis.
They are not. If they are not actively, intentionally taught, they evaporate.
But let's dig into the how. How did the daily life of this new generation cause them to completely disconnect from the faith of their parents?
You have to look at the massive socioeconomic transition that was occurring. The generation of Joshua were nomads. They were wanderers in a hostile desert.
Their daily survival depended entirely on miraculous intervention. Water from rocks, manna on the ground.
But this new generation, they are born in Canaan. They are transitioning from being nomadic warriors to being settled agriculturalists. They live in houses they didn't build. They are farming land they inherited.
So their daily reality completely shifted.
Exactly. And Henry points out that this new generation became entirely consumed by the business of settling the new land. They were focused on the immediate tasks of planting vineyards and raising livestock.
The parents were so busy building the physical infrastructure of the nation that they completely neglected to pass down the spiritual substance that justified the nation's existence.
They passed down the real estate, but they failed to pass down the why.
And nature abhors a vacuum. When this new generation realized they didn't truly know the Lord of their ancestors, they didn't just become secular atheists. The text says they immediately adopted the gods of the surrounding culture.
They forsook the Lord and served Baal and the Ashtaroth. Why those specific deities? What was the psychological pull?
It wasn't that they just woke up one day and decided to be evil. It was an incredibly pragmatic calculation based on their new agrarian lifestyle. Baal and Ashtaroth were the local deities associated with weather, storms, and agriculture.
So if you are a newly settled Israelite farmer and your family's survival depends on whether it rains during planting season, you are going to look for any advantage you can get.
Exactly. You look over at your Canaanite neighbor who has been farming this valley for centuries. He tells you, the invisible God of your desert ancestors is great for warfare, but if you want crops here, you have to appease Baal.
You have to participate in these specific fertility rituals. To an Israelite who hasn't been taught the absolute exclusivity of their covenant, participating didn't feel like a massive betrayal. It just felt like ancient risk management.
It was transactional religion. You put the ritual into the machine and you hope the rain comes out. It was the ultimate adoption of the dominant cultural paradigm.
This maps so perfectly onto the classic third-generation phenomenon we see in family wealth and business empires today.
Oh, it really does. The first generation builds the enterprise through immense sacrifice, grit, and late nights. The second generation grows up watching their parents bleed for the company, so they respect it.
They maintain it, they institutionalize it, but the third generation.
The third generation inherits the wealth and the freedom without ever having to experience the deprivation that was required to build it. They don't know the work which was done.
Exactly. And because they don't understand the cost of the structure they live in, they take it entirely for granted. They view the rules that built the wealth as outdated or restrictive.
They adopt the values of the affluent culture surrounding them. And statistically, the third generation is almost always the one that bankrupts the business.
When we inherit freedom, we have a fatal tendency to assume that this freedom is just the natural default state of the universe. We forget it was purchased with absolute adherence to specific principles.
And because we don't understand the cost, we easily discard the principles. This leaves us with a massive practical challenge. If you are a manager bringing new hires into a highly successful department, how are you actively fighting generational amnesia?
How are you intentionally teaching the history and the cost of your values? Because relying on cultural osmosis is a recipe for collapse.
Your culture will be hijacked by the loudest voices in the room within a single generation. And the immediate result of that generational amnesia in judges is the triggering of a brutal macro pattern.
Right. Starting in verse 14, the author essentially pauses the narrative to give us a table of contents for how the next few centuries are going to play out. It describes a relentless engine of self-destruction.
It is the ultimate downward spiral. The text lays out 5 distinct, highly predictable steps. Let's walk through the mechanics of this cycle.
Step 1 is apostasy. The text says they abandoned the Lord and went after other gods. Because they lack the historical anchor, they commit spiritual and cultural adultery.
They adopt the unethical business practices and degrading social norms of the Canaanites around them, which triggers, step 2, oppression.
The text uses incredibly stark language here. It says, the Lord's anger burned against Israel, and he delivered them into the hands of raiders who plundered them. He sold them into the hands of their enemies.
The phrase, he sold them, is fascinating.
Henry points out the legal weight of that phrase. Selling implies a transaction involving ownership and protection. God, acting as a protector who honors the covenant, looks at a people who repeatedly say, we don't want your rules.
He essentially says, okay, your request is granted. I am removing my protective hedge. Let's see how the Canaanite gods treat you.
He allows them to experience the unmitigated results of their own autonomous choices. The result is they are plundered and enslaved by the very cultures they tried to emulate.
That brings us to step 3, groaning. Verse 15 says they were in great distress. The pragmatic idolatry didn't work. The raiders steal their wealth, and they experience crushing misery. They cry out in pain.
And that cry initiates step 4, deliverance. Verse 16 tells us, the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hand of those who plundered them.
And the judge in this context isn't a guy in a black robe with a gavel. It is a charismatic, military leader like Gideon or Samson, empowered to break the physical oppression.
A judge steps in, fights the battle they couldn't fight, and restores order. But then we hit the final, most tragic element of the cycle. Step 5, relapse.
Verse 19 lays out the inevitability of it. But when the judge was dead, they turned back and dealt more corruptly than their fathers. They didn't cease from their practices or their stubborn ways.
This is the critical failure point. While the judge was alive, the people behaved, but their obedience was entirely externally motivated. They relied on the immense gravity of the leader to keep them in line.
So the moment the external support structure is removed, the moment the judge dies, they immediately regress to the mean.
And because the underlying appetite for compromise was never truly eradicated, the relapse is always worse, more corrupt than the previous generation's apostasy.
As you lay out those 5 steps, apostasy, oppression, groaning, deliverance, relapse, it is impossible not to recognize the exact clinical cycle of addiction.
It maps onto human psychology perfectly. The apostasy is the craving, the rationalization, and the eventual binge. You convince yourself you can handle just one more compromise.
The oppression is hitting rock bottom, the destruction of your career or your bank account. The groaning is the withdrawal, the desperation.
And the deliverance is the stint in rehab or the intervention from a friend who helps you establish temporary sobriety.
But the relapse occurs because, as we saw at Bochum, the internal altars were never torn down. As soon as the structured environment of rehab is removed, the addict returns to the substance, and the binge is exponentially more destructive.
You see the exact same cycle in corporate environments with crisis management. A highly successful company gets arrogant. To maximize quarterly profits, they quietly ignore safety protocols. That's corporate apostasy.
Eventually, a massive disaster occurs. Stock prices plummet. That is oppression and groaning. In a panic, the board hires a ruthless fixer CEO who implements rigorous new compliance rules deliverance.
But give it a decade. The fixer CEO retires. A new management team takes over. They look at the rigorous compliance rules and say, these are hurting our margins, let's relax them.
They forget the disaster that necessitated the rules, revert to their stubborn ways, and the company crashes all over again. Relapse. It is human nature stuck in a horrific, self-inflicted loop.
But within this incredibly dark cycle detailed in Chapter 2, there is a profound, almost contradictory insight about the nature of the divine that we have to examine.
Yes, verse 18. This is arguably the core wisdom about grace and compassion in the entire text. It says, "For it grieved the Lord because of their groaning by reason of those who oppressed them."
Other ancient translations, as Matthew Henry points out, phrase it as, "it repented the Lord," or "the Lord was moved with compassion."
The tension here is staggering. The text is incredibly explicit just a few verses earlier that God's anger burned against them. He actively sold them to their enemies as a direct punishment.
And yet, simultaneously, he is profoundly grieved by the suffering that punishment causes. How do we reconcile a burning anger with a grieving compassion?
It is a beautiful, deeply relational paradox. It tells us that God's compassion in this narrative is not triggered by the Israelites' perfect repentance. We already established their tears at Bochum produced no structural change.
His compassion is triggered by pure pity for their sheer, unvarnished misery. Henry makes a really sharp observation here.
What does he say?
He notes that when the Israelites groaned, they were likely not groaning under the heavy burden of their sin. They were simply groaning under the painful burden of their affliction.
They weren't crying because they had offended God. They were crying because slavery hurts.
And yet, even knowing that their sorrow was entirely self-centered, pure pity still moves the divine to rescue them anyway.
It is the ultimate picture of a parent watching a teenager make terrible choices. If you are a good parent, you have to enforce strict, painful boundaries. You might have to let them spend a night in jail.
Because you know they desperately need to hit rock bottom to understand the consequences. But even as you enforce that justice, watching your child suffer still breaks your heart.
And you will still ultimately step in to save them from total, unrecoverable ruin. The anger at the behavior and the deep grief over the suffering exist in the exact same heartbeat.
Precisely. But this dynamic leads us to a final, incredibly difficult piece of theology at the very end of the chapter. Because God does continue to raise up judges to rescue them, but he makes a definitive decision not to remove the source of their temptation.
Look at verses 21 through 23. God says, I also will no longer drive out any of the nations that Joshua left when he died, that by them I may test Israel to see if they will keep the Lord's way.
It's a tough passage.
I have to push back on this because to a modern ear, this sounds incredibly manipulative. It almost sounds cruel. If you know an addict is struggling, you don't intentionally leave a bottle of whiskey on their kitchen counter just to test them.
That is setting them up to fail.
Right. If God knows they are prone to idolatry, why purposefully leave the Canaanites in the land? How do we understand this with proper discernment?
It is a vital question.
Oh.
If we view God merely as a cosmic experimenter playing with lab rats, it absolutely seems cruel. But Matthew Henry clarifies the mechanism of this test perfectly.
Okay, lay it on me.
He points out a fundamental theological premise. God is omniscient. He already knows exactly what is in the hearts of the Israelites. He doesn't leave the Canaanites in the land to gather information about what Israel will do.
So who is the test actually for?
The test is for Israel. God says, I will test them. Not that I might know them, but that they might know themselves. He leaves the Canaanites there so that Israel will find out what they're actually made of.
Wow. The unremoved obstacles in our lives, the persistent temptations, they are mirrors.
That shifts the perspective entirely. Think about how often we pray for the universe to just magically remove all the friction from our lives. We want the toxic boss to get fired. We want the temptation removed from the house.
We want a perfectly smooth, friction-free existence so that we can easily be good people. But if the friction is entirely removed, we never develop actual moral muscle.
That is the core insight. If you are only faithful to your spouse because you are stranded on a desert island with no other options, are you actually faithful?
If you are only honest in your business dealings because every single transaction is heavily monitored by auditors, do you actually possess integrity?
You don't. You just possess circumstantial luck. You are confusing a lack of opportunity with the presence of virtue.
Exactly. The Canaanites were left in the land as a proving ground. They provided the necessary friction required for Israel to see their own profound weakness and their tendency toward compromise.
And ideally, to recognize their absolute need to depend on something greater than their own willpower. The obstacles were left to burn away the illusion of their own self-sufficiency.
So, as we wrap up this massive deep dive into the first 2 chapters of Judges, I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to mull over. It builds on everything we've discussed about the anatomy of compromise.
It's the ultimate takeaway from all this.
The Israelites entered the Promised Land with immense momentum, but they hit the valley, saw the iron chariots, and decided the fight was too hard. They chose the half-win.
And in their arrogance, they thought they were being clever. They thought they were in control by putting the Canaanites to forced labor.
But look at the ultimate reality of what happened. While the Israelites thought they were conquering the physical territory of the land, the Canaanite culture was slowly, quietly, and completely conquering the Israelites' hearts.
They won the geography, but they entirely lost their identity.
So I want you to look around the landscape of your own life, your own career, your own family dynamics today. What compromises are you keeping around because you are convinced you are using them to your advantage?
What toxic habit or ethically gray relationship are you avoiding fighting? Because it just seems easier to pay it a little tribute.
Are you absolutely sure that you are managing those compromises? Or are those compromises slowly, generation by generation, changing who you are?
The brutal reality of human history tells us that the credits don't just roll and give you a clean finish line.
The story keeps going, the Monday mornings keep coming, and the foundations you build on the cheap labor of compromise will eventually have to carry the full weight of your future. That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.